Добрый день. Спасибо большое всем
Hello.
сегодня пришедшим на этот семинар.
Thank you very much for
Спасибо
joining us
также
at this
тем,
webinar.
кто идет
Thank you.
еще в комнате ожидания.
Thank you to
Скажите,
those who've been
пожалуйста, если
waiting
можно тоже
to join us in the
поставить
waiting room. Please,
на
Catherine, let
несколько
others
людей.
in.
У нас, поскольку у нас сегодня много
Since
гостей,
today we have
незнакомых с
a
обычным
lot of
форматом этого
participants who
семинара, то
haven't
я
joined us
начну
before and who are
с
not familiar with the
формата.
format of this webinar series, I will introduce the
Скажу, что
format first.
вообще-то обычно мы
And
говорим
so
про
let me start from
исследования,
the
про
beginning that
монографии, про
normally we talk
статьи,
about the
посвященные
research
будущему тысячелетию.
monographies and articles about Soviet
Мы
dissidents.
говорим о подходах,
We speak about
а,
approaches
о том, кто как работает
and
иногда с
how
одним и
different
тем же
researchers approach
материалом.
even
В
the
этот
same
раз
material sometimes.
я нарушу
This time, I
несколько
diverted and actually
правил
broke
формата,
a series of
пригласив
rules of this format by inviting
Александру,
Alexandra Arkhipova.
которая, которую
Alexandra,
я, которая когда-то поставила мне 5 за то, что я знала, что такое сам издат.
Alexandra, many years ago, gave me the best top mark for knowing what samizdat means when we were both in Russian State University for Humanities. Later on, we've had many other occasions to interact.
Академия, да, народного хозяйства
We then had at
при
the
президенте
National
Российской
Economic
Федерации, а теперь
Academy, Presidential
лаборатория
Academy
социальной
in
антропологии
Russia.
Института
And
общих
now
социальных
Alexandra is a
исследований
laboratory
в
of social
Париже.
anthropology at the
Саша, добрый
School of
день.
Advanced
Добрый
Sociological
день.
Studies in Paris.
Спасибо,
Hello, Alexandra.
да,
Hello,
что
Sasha.
ты здесь.
Yes,
И
hello.
спасибо за
Thank you
то,
for
что
being
вы
here
помните про наш
and
формат,
thank you
который
for
мы действительно
remembering
сейчас
about an
нарушим.
attempt to remember
Что
our
Саша
format,
еще раз
which we will,
повторила,
of
что
course,
многие сегодня
divert
будут
from
очень
right now.
недовольны посмотреть на формат
Because
видеопротеста, о котором
I
Саша будет говорить.
assume many of the people joining us
Посмотрим
today are
на
actually interested in the
картинки.
visuals, in the pictures of those
Там
forms
будет
of
теория
protest happening
на
today.
этих картинках
There'll
тоже.
be also theoretical
Я
slides in the presentation.
не буду задавать вопросы в
I will
формате, не
not
будет
be
живая беседа, как обычно,
asking
но
questions in the way
потом
I usually
я
ask them during the
выдвину на
talk,
Сашу сколько-то
but
вопросов о
I
том,
will pour
как
some of my
же
questions on
она, как она
Alexandra after
говорила,
her
может
lecture.
соотноситься, может быть
And my
применима
questions will be focused on
к материалам,
how what
которым
she
мы
will have
занимаемся,
shared by
те,
then
те
with us
кто
relates to
бывают
the
на этом
materials
семинаре, то есть
of the normal
диссидентского
materials of this
протеста.
series of webinars, meaning the dissidents
Я
movement.
очень надеюсь,
I
что
sincerely hope
у нас будет разговор, что это будет,
that our
что мы будем
conversation
и
today
слушать, и
will be
спрашивать, и
successful,
говорить
that we
друг с
will be able
другом.
to
Поэтому,
discuss and
пожалуйста,
converse
выберите ту
and
форму, которая вам
participate
кажется
actively. So
удобной.
please
Можете
choose the form
писать в
that's good for
чате
you. You can use the chat
ваши вопросы,
to share your questions
пожелания, идеи,
or
ответы.
comments,
Или
ideas,
можете просто
suggestions,
поднимать руку, там
or
есть
you
такой
can raise your hand.
знак.
You see in the menu this
Очень вам
opportunity to raise your
предоставлю
hand with a
сейчас
yellow hand,
отличную
and
возможность
we will switch on your mic manually
сказать
because right now all the mics are off, and we will be able
Единственное, к
to
сожалению,
ask your
потому
question.
что мы не
We
знаем,
have to use this
кто как
function because
будет
we
слушать
don't
технически
know
возможно слушать лекцию, доклад,
how, because you're
выступление.
quite
Если
numerous, and
придут
in order to listen to the
100
lecture,
человек, спросим,
when we are over 300 here, for example, it will be a little bit challenging. So that's why all the mics are off for now.
Важную вещь я упустила. У
I
нас
forgot an important thing,
будут
that we have
переводчики.
interpreters
Большое
working with
спасибо.
us. Thank
Сегодня,
you very much to the
наверное, может быть
interpreters.
труднее даже, чем
They will have it
обычно.
harder than normally
Вы
today.
можете там, где значок глобуса,
Underneath in the menu, you will
нижней
have a
правой
globe
части
icon in
линейки
the bottom menu on the right.
возможностей
You can click on the
выбора
globe
выбрать
icon
один
and
из
choose the
языков.
language that
Буду
you want to listen
выбрать
to.
языков
It'll be one of the
английский или
languages available in
русский.
either English or Russian.
Если я забыла что-то самое
If I
важное,
forgot
значит,
something
уже
important,
забыла.
well,
Наверное,
so be
теперь
it.
пишите, пожалуйста, если по формату или по
Please
любым вопросам у вас там есть
address
вопросы или
us in the
пожелания,
chat
пишите мне,
about the
пожалуйста,
format or
в
about the
чат, и я
content of the
передаю
conversation, and use the
слово
chat.
Александре
And I'm now
Архиповой.
happy to give the mic and the floor to
Всем
Alexandra.
добрый день.
Hello, everyone.
Спасибо большое, что сегодня вы
Thank you
уделили
very
нам
much
немного своего времени.
for
И сегодня мы
spending your time on
поговорим
joining the
о
conversation today.
очень своеобразном типе
And today we will
сопротивления,
talk
который
about a very
называется
particular kind
теневой
of
протест.
dissident movement. It's a
Иногда
shadow
называют
protest, sometimes it's called. or hidden protest, or indirect protest, and many other terms used. And how is it related to the Soviet past, especially the 60s and 70s, and how it is related to what is happening now in Russia? And first of all, let's think about this. Often when we speak about protest and of the situation when the situation in the country is difficult and challenging, quite often it's considered that the citizens have several opportunities. They have express their loyalty, they can raise their voice, it's a direct protest, or they can exit or leave the country. In modern world, we quite clearly see, especially we the Russians, that that those three options are in front of us, but we know that there is the fourth option, fourth solution or behavior choice, which is sometimes hidden as weak protest, indirect protest, shadow protest. When people start without leaving the country, without the opportunity, having an opportunity to leave or express their protest openly, explicitly, because there is a severe punishment, and not wishing to express loyalty, people find other forms of weak protest, and they express it with hidden messages. And that's what we will be talking today about. And here we have to understand that the main common part of what I'm talking about today, the main component, we have to understand that in those approaches, in those schools and streams that we will consider today, protest is a message. It is a form of communication. And as in any communication, there is an addressant, a sender, who sends to the recipient, to addressee, a message. And that message has a code. When a grandma in a northern Russian village comes to a tomb of her relative, she can bow down, and this is a message. This code is action. So the message is greeting, but it can use the code bowing down, but she can also use her words, and then there's a verbal message. Hello, my dear. So the message is the same, but there can be different codes. So protest is also a message, but and we have to keep that in mind always, because it's a form of communication. And today we will be talking about indirect protest as a form of communication. And today we'll be talking about four main approaches. The first one is the known concept of the weapon of the weak. It was outlined by James Scott, a known anthropologist, in his book of the 1989, which was called precisely Weapons of the Weak, and then developed further in a very telling name, Domination and the Arts of Resistance. Domination and the Arts of Resistance. And the art of resistance is a short summary of what James C. Scott focuses on his research. He's a specialist in Southeastern Asia. He wrote his thesis in Malaysia, and there, observing the peasants who are not very fond of their authorities, especially the representatives of authorities who collect taxes, they still can't allow themselves to explicitly voice their opposition. The risks are too high. So he observed that those people actually use these weak indirect forms of protest, which they direct first and foremost towards their own group. Classic example, which is simplified, of course, is that when a peasant who is approached by the tax collectors and are stripping him of all his of everything, he bows down at the same time with holding a gesture behind his back, and that gesture that is seen by his friends, but it's not being seen by the tax collector. And this is the classic example of the weapon of the weak. And that weak weapon of the weak creates an opinion about the powerful among the weak. And that's why for him, gossip and rumor are forms of that weapons that shouldn't be ignored from his anthropologist's point of view. So they're dominant elites, according to James Scott, that control the public space. And the control of the public space is something we'll get back later on. When the weak are left voiceless, they use public transcripts. For those who are using the word, for those who know Russian, comment on the word transcript because it's both a message and so it's deciphering and ciphering at the same time. So in the public space, the weak have to play out the scripts of obedience. They have to show express their loyalty. From the point of view of the Soviet period, which this series of February is focused on, this is, for example, 1st of May demonstrations and public protests, public demonstrations, when the Soviet citizen had to parade with flags and balloons for peace, for labor, for May, for long live Comrade Brezhnev. They're demonstrating the publicly demonstrating their obedience, and that is the public transcript. But there is and that is a stage space. But there is also an off-stage space, behind the curtain space, where groups of weak, of subordinates, they use the hidden transcripts, so hidden messages, to convey their true opinion about something that's happened. And not to convey it to the authorities, but to their own circle. And that they express their insubordination, but mitigating the risks using the anonymity, for example. So, for example, on the left, you see a graffiti from Voronezh in Russia, 2019, where it is used. Looks like a children's charade, but if you look through it, you'll see this cipher. The word ciphered there is dictatorship. And through such forms, the hidden transcripts, it can take the form of charades, anecdotes, jokes, graffiti, rumors and gossip. So any form of anonymous, indirect messaging. And between the hidden transcripts and public transcripts, there is also a space of what James Scott calls cordon sanitaire, sanitary cordon block.
The cordon sanitaire is a space where this kitchen talk cannot permeate. This world, this model that James Scott describes is not very stable. That's why these hidden transcripts are always trying to destroy the boundaries of this kitchen talk world. And when they do manage to break through the sanitary cordon, when they enter the public space, the space that is usually taken up by public transcripts, by expressions of loyalty, that's when revolution happens. That's what happened in Berlin a few days, a few months before the wall was torn down, when first a number of political jokes and memes started going around, and then these jokes started breaking through the sanitary cordon and breaking into the streets, into the world, and they started taking up more and more space, more public space, and that was a revolution that took place without spilling any blood. In order for those hidden messages to exist, they have to be masked. They have to be masked either by anonymity or by total ambiguity. Anything that is said off stage openly, in public, can only be expressed in a very vague and ambiguous way. You can only afford to say this openly in the comfort of your kitchen. When you bring it outside, you have to mask it. It's interesting, if I may say so, it's important to understand that in the Soviet Union, the Soviet authorities were very sensitive to all forms of hidden transcripts, to anything outside of public transcripts. So on the slide, there's a transcript of how Fried was being interrogated. He was very young. He was about 15 years old at the time. And on his first day of interrogation, he says, yes, I was talking to my friends. This is the 50s. Says, yes, my friends and I were talking about how accepting payment for education goes against the institution, and that the deputies of the Soviets do not solve this problem. But how is this anti-Soviet? And the inspector said, tell me this, Fried, would you say this at the Komsomol meeting at your university? No, I would not. So how would you call this kind of talk? Is it Soviet? Well, no, I guess it's not very Soviet. So the big question is, would you say this at your faculty meeting? Would you say this at your Komsomol meeting? The inspector understands very well where the boundaries of the public and hidden transcript lies, where the sanitary cordon lies. And Fried is accused of bringing this hidden discourse into the public sphere. There's a wonderful book, which is a collection of documents. It's called Kramola, Dissidents in the USSR under the rule of Khrushchev and Brezhnev. It was compiled by Olga Edelman. An important thing about this book is that when we talk about protest in the Soviet Union, first and foremost, people think of the dissidents, the intelligentsia, and their dissidents. Their demonstrations in the 60s, their letters from the camps, the publication of books that they were jailed for, that is all true. However, in the Soviet Union, there was also a huge amount of formats that also may be considered a form of protest. And if we have a look at this book by Kozlov and Edelman, we can see that there are different forms of protest. I've kind of differentiated them into direct or public forms and hidden forms. So the direct forms are slogans and caricatures and leaflets and letters to the authorities, poetry, desecration of monuments, and swearing at Stalin. But also in the book, you will find a million of forms of hidden protest. These were things that were disseminated among people. These were like jokes and rumors, caricatures that people made for themselves, something they wrote in their diaries, some anti-Soviet stuff that they wrote in their diaries, some ambiguous texts. So it's so ambiguous that, let's say, if a person tells a joke and that is being incriminating, they say, well, come on, it's just a joke. What are you saying? It's not a slogan that I've posted publicly. These hidden forms of protest were plenty. And we mustn't forget that they did exist. We're going to have a closer look at such forms of protest in today's world and in the Soviet Union. These hidden forms of protest that Soviet citizens resorted to are these weapons of the weak, according to James Scott. Let's have a look at two examples. A direct protest, 1969, Mr. Bondir, at his faculty meeting, condemned the intervention into Czechoslovakia. he was fired from his university. He left the city. After that, he went into an open protest where he said, you know, shame on the criminal leadership of this Soviet leaders. And then 1932, there's also a note from the Joint State Political Directorate that is a testament to the weapons of the weak. 5 people in the Novopokrovsky region are singing a song that says, "I'm sitting on something made of gold. I will not go to the kolkhoz. Give us back Tsar Nicholas." This is bordering on riot. The people who were singing this, they would say, "Oh, but anyone could do that. Maybe we were drunk. Maybe we were just repeating something we'd heard." So James Scott would call this a hidden transcript, because on the one hand, it's true that there's no direct message compared to Bonder, who said, pulled out that poster. He realized what the risks were when he pulled out that poster. Whereas the situation on the right is just a funny little song. It's not individualized. That's why anyone who is caught singing that song would say, "Oh, well, everyone's singing it. It's not my own doing." By the same token, these songs were performed not by people in the kolkhoz, not representatives of the kolkhoz, not the representative of the authorities. It is done kind of by the people for their own. In that way, they create an alternative perception of reality. And that is the aim of the weapons of the weak. Their aim is not to overthrow the government, but to create an alternative public transcript, an alternative perception of reality. And there are many such examples indeed. Let's have a look at one of these rare examples of graffiti that was made in 1976 by a fisherman who was saying, "You are crucifying freedom, but the soul of a human does not know death." And then there's a poster of 2017, a similar message. Something that the Soviet authorities have been combating and that our authorities today still combat today are messages left on voting bulletins. This is from the collection of Alexander Forkin. Thank you very much. So he wrote, who am I supposed to cross out? So he's making fun of the fact that there's only one candidate from the party. And similarly, there's a message from the 2018 elections making fun of that, of the fact that there are no real options. These forms of protests are not unique to the Soviet Union, and there's a wonderful monograph of Kathleen Stokker, Folklore Fights the Nazis, where you will find many hidden messages, many hidden transcripts from Norway in the 1940s. Let's say over Christmas, there was this postcard that looks innocuous. If you look at it very attentively, if you look at the chest, if you look at it at a certain angle, you will see the sign of the king, who is the imagined head of the Norway anti-Nazi resistance. It's very difficult for us to see this on this picture, but trust me, it's there. The second approach that we should look at today is the semiotic guerrilla warfare. The author of this term is Umberto Eco. But first, before we look at it, let's have a look at my favorite joke from the 1970s, when Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and Napoleon Bonaparte are at the Red Square parade. Oh, says Alexander the Great, if I had these tanks, I would conquer the world. If I had these kinds of planes, said Julius Caesar, the Roman Empire wouldn't have fallen. Oh, come on, says Napoleon. If I had the Soviet newspaper Pravda, nobody would have known that I lost the Battle of Waterloo. This joke contains the essence of his idea. In the 1960s, he gives a lecture about semiotic guerrilla warfare. And in the 80s, it's released as a separate article. In this article, Umberto Eco talks about how there will be a future in which a number of dominants will rule over all of the messages and all of the signals that pass through the earth. And semiotic partisans will not be able to control the entire media space, but they will be able to explode from within the signal of the dominant group or change its content. So there will be only one way of getting into the public space. We'll have to change the signal that's already coming in. And that's where semiotic partisans will come in. They will change it to something else. They will play around with it. Add an additional letter. You'll see some examples of this.
And I call these people semiotic guerrilla fighters. We had multiple examples of such fights and warfare in the Soviet past, and today, in the modern world, semiotic guerrilla fighters are trying to break through the information blockade. And, for example, when the word war was forbidden in Russia in early March 2022, the graffiti in St. Petersburg appeared saying, say out loud war, say war out loud. And this is an example of distorting or destroying the signal from within. And unlike the kitchen conversations, unlike the hidden transcripts of James Scott, these things happen not exactly in an off-stage space, because this is public space. And so the semiotic guerrilla fighters are actually fighting for being represented in that semiotic space. Who are these semiotic partisans? We can say that they are one unified monolithic group, because those who wrote something on the Soviet election bulletins, they were also very diverse. The youngest semiotic partisan I know, whom I talked to, was 14, the oldest 89. And these are lonely wolves, but they're looking for allies. But their main task is to break through this information blockade of Umberto Eco, who foretold it so aptly. And I'd like to show you this quotation from a conversation with one of my informants who lives in St. Petersburg. She has 2 kids. She can't leave Russia. And so at 3 a.m., when this is still, when the kids are asleep and there's still some northern lights, or like some night lights available in St. Petersburg, she puts such small models and figures, and she puts them around St. Petersburg, and with the goal to evoke empathy and good emotion, so that people see them, take them with their hands, and think of something positive. And they think that killing other people is not good. And this is a classic example. remember we spoke about the three options available that those who live under authoritarian regime have: loyalty, raising their voice, like a direct protest, or leaving the country, the exit. But the people whom I talk to, they can't use neither of these three options. They can't leave, the risks are too high, and they can't be loyal. So they find for themselves this fourth option, which is the semiotic guerrilla warfare. Third approach that I wanted to talk to you today about, it was in the center of attention of it's in Alf Lüdke from Germany wrote about it and called it Eigen-Sinn. So one's self-will, or if you want, we can call it
Умберто Эко был историком литературы и семиотиком, а Лютке он
headstrongness, contrariness. Yeah. So he was, Alf Lüdke was a historian, not a sociologist or anthropologist, and he studied the behavior of people, behavior of workers in the end of 19th century and in the Nazi times. And he formulated that this Eigen-Sinn, or as contrariness or self-will, let's use it. This is close to what James Scott wrote about, but there is still a slight difference. Lüdke says that, and his school say that in reality, whether we want it or not, the majority of people in a country, however the strange or cruel the regime is, they don't protest. The majority doesn't protest. So these people saying that Russians are genetic slaves or whatever, from the point of view of political studies or history, is wrong, because whether it's positive or not, but wherever there is an authoritarian regime, majority doesn't protest directly, because they are well aware of their risks, and they honestly consider that this is not the aim of their life, not the hill they want to die on. So the politologists quite often say that this is a lack of political awareness or political conscience, but a lot of people actually have this Eigen-Sinn, so self-will, which is a set of social practices, as the anthropologists would say, from false obedience to hidden hint. So the self-will practices, they allow you to do something to remain yourself. This is not a political statement, as people would like, those who call you for direct protest would like you to do. And it's false obedience or hidden hints. It's an opportunity to preserve yourself, like keep yourself for yourself. And this self-will gives you space for maneuver. So here you see, after the war started, I asked the subscribers of my Telegram channel to send me the examples, and people have shared with me the stories of how they rebel or how they. And here are the examples. Quite often they've made a tattoo of 8 stars, нет войне, so, and this tattoo is in a hidden place on the body where one can see it. So, and the people wear signs or some blue ribbons or something as a sign of support for Ukraine. So somewhere where others can see it. And for us, this looks like as funny, because people readers of my Telegram channel say, "Oh, yeah, you're a nation of slaves." No, this is not about the slavery or mentality, but it's for preserving oneself in spite of risks, and to preserving the maneuver space. Now let's go through the examples of this Eigen-Sinn. So a person says, I painted the Easter eggs with almost blue and almost yellow, and I made a photo and posted it online. So this is a form of Easter greetings online, but this is a form of hidden protest, and no one can accuse you of anything. Eigen-Sinn is a form also quite often used by parents. For example, the surveys of school students, there's the students ask their parents about patriotism, and the parents say, "Oh, yes, but we can't download this," or we can't access this form or something, and after 50 of such forms, the people from the administration say, "Oh, forget about it." Or when the children went to the Patriotic Museum or whatever the name is, my children became sick and they didn't go to school. Another form of Eigen-Sinn is the provocation. For example, I wear black ribbon instead of a button on my coat, and it's because black is a sign of grief. And I'm waiting for people to ask me, why do you have a black ribbon? Someone died in your family? And so if they ask me questions, and then I can tell them, yes, because in the bombardment of Ukraine, there are a lot of casualties. So this is kind of provocation, inviting people to for a conversation. So we have these forms of indirect hidden message to become a semiotic partisan. And we have around 10 minutes since we left more. There was a question in the chat, actually. Eigen-Sinn, is it also communication or not? Yes, of course, said Alexandra, but it's self-communication, auto-communication, because I'm showing something to myself. I communicate with my circle, my inner circle, and my friends, my husband, my children, my very close relatives. So the sender, me, and the addressee is a very narrow circle of people. So let's look at knowing these three approaches. I remind you. So the three approaches: indirect hidden message for your group or for yourself, which is there's substituting the signal or becoming semiotic partisan. These are three approaches. And let's look at the contemporary material in the modern day Russia protests. And in the 8 minutes that I have left, I'll try to analyze what's happening in Russia. So this, there was an exhibition of street art, anti-war street art in Russia. It was called Нет Voble, which is similar to Нет Войне. It was very important for us to show not just how professional artists protest, but actually how an abstract John Smith or Mary Smith or Maria Ivanova protests, someone who never drew anything, nor wrote anything, how they are trying to break through the sanitary cordon and enter the stage, or upstage, in using James Scott terms. In our database, we have a whole typology, like diversity of examples. We remind everyone that these are messages. And so let's swiftly and fastly, quickly go through the tips. The first type is direct message. Why are you silent? So the addressee is someone who is either supporting the war or ignoring more often what's happening. Much more interesting type is the sharing of emotions, when semiotic partisans who go into the offstage space, they quite often don't want to talk about the war. Not because it's useless, but just people are so much afraid of this topic that they're trying to talk about it. So they're looking for allies by sharing their emotions, the emotions that fill you and that you want to share. So, for example, dear passerby, I'm against Z too. I'm also afraid. All both examples are from St. Petersburg. Another example of a semiotic messaging. It's a classic semiotic warfare in Umberto Eco terms. He spoke that in a situation of hegemony and total control over the information sources, you can't broadcast your message, but you can substitute the message just broadcast by the authorities. That's the type that we call counter message. And let's look at how semiotic partisans substitute the message. You see the window here. This is the 9th of May, and in the window, there's the flag, the national flag of Russia in the window. And this is the patriotic 9th of May ballot. And then someone wrote on the wall, everything like in the 40s, but we are the fascists now. And this is a classic counter message.
Сигнала власти наоборот. Давайте вернемся к тому фрагменту лекции.
Reversing the message of the authorities. Now, referring back to the fragment of the lecture where we talk about James Scott.
Они принуждают слабых в публичном пространстве к
Powerful groups force the obedient ones for plays of obedience, where you have to express those public transcripts.
Мы видели их, видимо, сейчас, но особенно их много было в
Those
2020.
obedience plays are still present, but mostly we most often saw them in 2022. For example, students in Kazan were forced to light their windows that would show the Z and V letters, and on the picture on the right is the giant Z letter for children in a hospice. So the counter messages from partisans are actually reversing this. For example, someone put the used the letter Z to express their support for the war, and partisans put the letters P and C around it, which reversed the meaning. Because it started looking like a shot for something. Or, for example, the word
Визуальное переворачивание. Так, например, журналистка Мария Антюшева в Красноярске пришла на брифинг полиции, и когда она скинула пальто, она оказалась одета в
In
желто-голубое.
the same way, Maria Antusheva, when she was brought to the briefing to the police station, she wore blue and yellow. And that way she kind of subverted this message, and she was fined for this. This kind of counter message can often be found when there's, let's say, a public space, the stage, where there's these usual messages, these signals from the authorities. Let's say these seats are for people with disabilities, for pregnant women. And the subversion happens when the text is changed to these are seats for those who return from Ukraine and the mothers who will give us more children. Another form is camouflage. When IKEA closed down in Russia, all over the country there would be posters and leaflets saying IKEA sale. But when people follow that QR code, they'll find themselves on an anti-war website. Also, these announcements on houses. Oh, the left one says, cheap package tours abroad and nationally. And then the fine print says, they won't be available unless we stop the war and say no to the war. Who are the addressees? What do you do when you walk your dog in the evening? Are you bored? You're probably bored, you're probably cold. And what you do is you start reading all of these messages. And if you want to hide it from those who kind of take down these announcements, you want to kind of mask it, you want to camouflage it. Another example is when the phrase the 9th of May is written kind of in reverse, it looks like the word war. One form of such camouflage is a kind of is one of these posters that says lost dog. And then when you read the fine print, you see it's run away from Russia's invasion to Ukraine. Its name is future. Your children will not have future if we do not find it, and so on and so forth. Another type is coding, coded messages. When we look at camouflage, they look innocent, they look innocuous, whereas coded messages make no sense when you look at them. So the words, it says two words, but it actually has the message, carries the message of no to war, or urim rim, which translates to peace to the world. Again, 3-5 is a code for no to war. And I would like to remind you that in Russia, you cannot say the word war without being fined or jailed. Sometimes people just write 35, or they find more exquisite ways, such as these pictures of bottles of cognac. This is an anti-war message because the first bottle of cognac has 3 stars and the second has 5 stars, and together they make the message "No to War." Another form of such messages was any kind of reference to the ballet Swan Lake. This was part of the morning ritual. Oh, it used to be shown a lot in the Soviet Union at public events, and after the 1991 Soviet coup d'etat attempt, there was no information on it, and this ballet is what was shown on all TV channels. As of that time, this ballet became a symbol of the death of the leader and some changes to come. When I was looking for these pictures, I just went to the online stream of this ballet, and this is what I found. These are the comments, a myriad comments. This is just the first 5 comments on the screenshot, where people use ambiguous messages, hidden messages, in order to express their attitude to what's going on in the country. That's why each of these messages can be deciphered in 2 ways. Dear citizens, play this beautiful music on your streets. Let's not let the classics die. Or we should sign a petition to have this beautiful number shown on every TV in the country. I love seeing this early in the morning. I can't wait for the broadcast. And gradually, this ballet becomes a symbol of people coming together. These semiotic guerrillas, the members of the opposition, start using this as a symbol of a uniting message. So we can look at these headless ballet dancers from 2022, and also this sticker. We can see that there are 3 and 5 ballerinas. They also form the message "No to War." There are also very difficult charades. Very often Chinese or Korean is used in order to cipher the message. And then a real charade from Nizhny Novgorod is very complicated to read. You can try and decipher it if you like. You can look at the, it's like the dancing persons of Arthur Conan Doyle. You can decipher it. A woman in Tyumen wanted to write "No to War" using these stars, asterisks, but she was detained. But she told the judge that she was trying to write the phrase "No to Wobla," no to the fish, Wobla. So you cannot say the word "war" in Russia. That's why we use asterisks to hide it. And that's why, and because Wobla and war sound similar in Russian and they have the same number of letters, this also became a meme like the ballet Swan Lake, and it had a uniting kind of function, and many people were also writing "No to Wobla." People were also demonstratively protesting against the war by using these 3 and 5 asterisks as a symbol of the phrase "No to War." They were protesting the censorship. The idea being that even if you go out with a poster that just has asterisks, you can be detained. In that way, this public transcript becomes demonstrative. There's another very interesting instance that I'd like to mention. You can also use a sort of like 0 sign, just the code without the message. So a woman went out with a single piece of paper that had nothing on it. The message was clear, and she was detained. And this story kind of really reeks of the Soviet Union, because this is just a repetition of what happened to the dissidents in the Soviet Union. There's also meta text, when all the graffiti is being painted over. They say it's a graffiti about the graffiti. So that sign said a message that I will be jailed for 5 years for. So these are all the forms of protest in Russia. If we look at all the hidden protest, the shadow protest, if we look at it as semiotic guerrilla warfare, on the one hand, they're playing with the message, but also with the code. So we have direct messages, sharing emotions, commemorative messages, but also counter messages, camouflage, coded messages, pseudo messages, zero messages, and meta messages. And of course, the question, it begs the question, why do semiotic partisans use this instead of direct messages? Why don't they just say no to war? And I'm sure that many of you listening have this question as well. The answer is fourfold. The first answer is kind of like the insider's answer. It helps to avoid censorship. It helps stop the person being detained. These people who paint over the graffiti don't usually pay attention to these hidden messages and these lost dog posters. The second answer is social interpretation, should say social, not cognitive. Censorship has deprived people of a civic voice. And that's why people want to leave all kinds of messages. The more nonsensical ones, the more nonsensical they are, the better. The more ambiguous it is, the better. Then we can also talk about cognitive interpretation. Our brain really likes riddles and puzzles. And when we see a message that's not clear, we kind of go back to it and we try to decipher it. We get pleasure out of it. We get an endorphin boost. And with that, we memorize it a lot better. Therefore, from an evolutionary standpoint, what will win is not the direct message of no to war, because people are tired of it. What will win are the hidden messages, because you see it, you have a higher chance of memorizing it, and you have a higher likelihood of disseminating it. That's why these semiotic games are going to win in this kind of war. I would like to invite you to join my Telegram channel. We discuss these things very often, and I'm pretty good with the timing. Thank you very much. I think it was very good that we kept to the format and didn't interrupt you. However, there are several questions. So we have two options. I can read the questions, or if the people who ask these questions want to unmute, you are welcome to raise your hand. Just so that we can have this conversation. The first two big questions, the one from Klavdia Smola. As many researchers point out, this kind of provocation and ambiguity have become a weapon of the Putin regime itself and the media space within, outside of politics. In that way, this symbolic resistance has changed very much since Soviet times. How do hidden transcripts affect the authorities and the public sphere as compared to the USSR? Margarita Simonyan and Maria Zakharova do deal with that. Putin likes to joke as well, but I don't think that the Soviet Union was devoid of this. And the book of Evgeny Dobryenko, State Laughter, illustrates this very well. It's very much known that Stalin liked to joke. So this was a thing of Stalin's time as well. And it's only after the Soviet Union that the regime becomes so strict towards it. So I'm not sure that making fun on the part of the authorities was non-existent.
Пожалуйста, я на самом деле не хотела бы узурпировать роль вот того, кто
I
читает.
wouldn't like to hijack the role of someone who reads out the comments from the chat. So, Klavdia, if you want to respond, to discuss or dispute, let us know. We will unmute you. Maybe we can unmute you already now.
То есть я считаю, что в вопросе Клавдии там на самом деле два вопроса. Первый вот как бы про стёб. Я, во-первых, считаю, что действительно стёб и в советское время существовал.
So the Klavdia's question had two parts. One was about mockery and banter, and I think that it did exist in Soviet times. The second part was how the hidden transcripts have an impact and influence the authorities today, and significantly. It's arms race in a way, because people come up with ways to use the blue and yellow colors, like socks or Easter eggs, or it's a popular socks of two different colors, blue and yellow, are a popular form of Eigen-Sinn in Russia. But it is followed also by the area of legal practices, and people are already being punished for that. In 2022, people were not published for such forms. Now for yellow boots with blue shoelaces, people are already being prosecuted. So the law enforcement and prosecution field is following the semiotic practices.
Клавдия, я включила звук, на самом деле, если есть.
Klavdia, I've actually unmuted you if you want to say something or to add something, please do.
Алло, да. Не очень хорошо слышно, мне кажется.
We can't hear you really well, but very distantly.
Да, лучше.
Спасибо, да.
Thank you for the lecture.
Вера Дубина была с нами. И не знаю, слышно ли сейчас или не очень?
Да, слышно.
Александра не слышит.
Переводчики почти не слышат.
Ну да.
Может быть, дело в наушниках. Немножечко подвинуть наушники, уже становится легче. Нет? Не помогает?
Не знаю, слышно ли так?
Да,
Вот,
слышно.
Да,
Здравствуйте.
гораздо лучше, да.
Простите, у меня новый компьютер, поэтому мне...
Yes, sorry, my computer is new. Thank you very much for the lecture. And my comment on the margins, that 2 years ago we had a summer school and a conference focused on Eigen-Sinn in micropolitics, and we had Vera Dubina participating, and we discussed this problem and issue that the former languages of protest have been desemiotized, because in Putin's elections or in marches, of pro-Putin's patriotic rock concert, for example, they are using the symbolic words and the codes, or even not coded messages. They're using formulas that used to be part of the public space in Soviet times. They used to be anti-Soviet, and nowadays they've become the language of many different communities in modern day Russia, including the patriotic rap performers. So the question arises: what has changed since the Soviet times? I think that these messages or transcripts play even small. It plays even smaller role than it used to in Soviet times, and I think the symbolic protest has even less of impact than it used to. And I'm not speaking about all of it together, but like wordplay or semiotic charades. Thank you. Thank you very much for the question. I think it's a question of how to weigh and assess this, because whether this has an impact or not, these are just words. We need to find an measurement tool, something that can help us to assess whether this plays a role or not. Is there an impact or not? So if we take a look at the database on protests in Soviet times that I used to be working with for Olga Edelman's book, how with the protocols and how people were persecuted for their freedom of speech, we will see there that with decreasingly between 53 till 85 people were sent to jail for such symbolic protests, decreasingly. We can clearly see this in statistics. So the weight of those jokes and inscriptions on bulletins and everything, they were less and less criminalized and more was permitted. And this is the measurement tool we can use. But if we look at the legal practices of today, and I assess that a lot, we will see that people are actually being persecuted and sent to jail increasingly, or being punished in a different way with non-judicial reforms. So they're forced to apologize, they're being fired, and so on and so forth. So the relative weight of that symbolic protest in terms of being persecuted is actually growing. So if we take this as a criteria, and we see that these symbolic actions are actually much more important and impactful than in 1979, for example. They're being used as a pretext for punishment and persecution much more often than that in 40 years ago. Thank you so much. There are some more questions, and I will read through those as well in the chat, and also a few raised hands in the participants list. I would actually broaden the concept of voice loyalty exit, not with just hidden protest, but with sabotage in general, which in particular form is hidden protest as a form of ideological diversion. When I speak of sabotage in broader sense, I want to remind you about the ethics and practices of relating to state of a weak Soviet citizen living in an atomized society that can be reflected in some sayings. For example, you can steal a nail from your workplace because you are an owner and not a guest. They pretend to be paying us salary and we pretend to be working, and so on. How do you think the adaptation of contemporary Russian atomized society to the conditions of survival and new socioeconomic and political conditions, can it follow the same pattern of the Soviet times, when citizens repeat all the symbols of all creeds and rituals of loyalty, but in the shadow of Leviathan, they use its resources to fill their household, to boost their household income? You know, symbolic protests these days are not limited to sabotage. Without sabotage is its large protest. So, for example, when children are not being sent to the patriotic classes, that pretending to be sick, that's sabotage. But when people use blue and yellow socks, that's not sabotage. So sabotage is a big important part of this, and there's huge amount and diversity of forms. Like any interview with parents in school, it becomes a story of how we sabotage the ideological practices of schools. And so, just as in Soviet times, sabotage is very much active. We don't notice it, but it's omnipresent. We have a lot of raised hands. So next questions. what is the criteria to discern the hidden message from non-hidden? If it's being ciphered, it doesn't guarantee you that not being persecuted. Maybe in these circumstances, we would need to say that the direct protest tries to mimic the hidden and becomes more expressive in this. If we go back to the hidden transcript term by James Scott, the original term, it doesn't mean, he didn't mean whether the messages can be understood or not. It's not whether it's ciphered or not. It's the distinction is who is the addressee. And from the very beginning, that's where I spoke about this semiotic scheme. From James Scott's point of view, hidden transcripts are the messages that are addressed towards your own, and it's hidden from the view of the authorities. They hidden not in terms of being ciphered, but hidden from the authorities, not accessible by the authorities. That's what the hidden word means here. And that's when a joke, when everything is clear, it's still a hidden message because you spread it among your own group of people. It's your own circle, and you are not using a stage space in front of the authorities. And so when we go back to James Scott terminology, we have to remember that his concept was based first and foremost on the idea of messages. And so you really need to know whom you're talking to, authorities or someone outside of the authorities level.
Много вопросов, и я боюсь, мои уже...
A lot of questions, and I'm afraid that there's no time for all of them, but so my question is...
Твою выставку, ну, всем, да, очень рекомендую для души, а не для интеллекта, просто посмотреть выставку «Нет вобля». Онлайн она вполне доступна. Так вот.
I recommend all of you, just for your interest and pleasure, to observe the exhibition, online exhibition, not No Vobla. But so watching it, I have this question. For example, I'm also afraid. The message itself, it doesn't necessarily relate to the words. There's no guarantee that it relates to a social topics in any case. It's highly probable, and we are ready to consider this, but there are like graffiti, I love you, and somehow the addressee should be able to understand that it's related to them. So how do you...
базе данных, то ли нет, и как часто,
How do you realize that this is a graffiti or an object that fits into your concept and your exhibition? What's the percentage, perhaps? Of course, there are messages that we are not 100% sure that this is that it fits political landscape. With I'm also afraid, we had no doubts. And formally, this doesn't fall under censorship. And I'm also afraid it was very clear for us that it relates to the situation in the war. I missed one question on the chat. I will go back to it. And then I will switch on the mics to those who have raised their hands. Please remember that your mic is on, even if you are not asking this question right now. And difficulties for me is that I'm not always sure whether this is a nickname or a real name. So I'm not sure I should be actually speaking out loud the names. But let me first read the message from the chat. In general, you show the examples from public space. Is there a similar material from virtual space, which is in a way also public? Thank you for the lecture. Well, besides the memes that you can see online, I would also draw your attention to a very interesting form of virtual protest. Dashiravich, my colleague, described it in 2015, I think. And those are These were the signs on Yandex Maps or Yandex chats in Yandex, different services of Yandex. For example, the signs in Yandex Maps or other services of Yandex, you can leave your comments. For example, there is a traffic jam here, and people use it to say no to war, and this happens quite often. Yandex fights this resurfaces, and so on and so forth. This is a form of virtual protest.
Так, я пытаюсь включить,
I'm trying to unmute themselves to those who want to ask a question. Please switch on your mic and ask your question.
Здравствуйте, можно задать вопрос?
Да-да.
Это не Ирина, мы тут группой сидим, как бы, но не суть.
Hello, I'm not Irina. We're just a group of people here. I just wanted to ask a clarification question, which follows the question of someone else. How do we assess the impact and the influence of hidden messages? As far as I understood from the webinar, please be closer to your mic because you disappear at times. As far as I understood through the webinar, from the lecture, please correct me if I'm wrong. So the aim is not to overthrow the government, but to spread your understanding of reality into the public space. So to spread the discourse and ideas, what is right and what is wrong.
Оценивать успешность таких вот скрытых посланий в наказуемости.
Is it correct to assess the impactfulness of such hidden message through the level of persecution?
Несогласия более жестко карали, менее жестко карали. Разве здесь...
I'm sorry, it's very hard to hear the person speaking.
Как раз-таки оценивать не потому, насколько...
Пожалуйста, дорогой автор вопроса, напишите свой вопрос. Пропадает половина...
Please type your question because we can barely hear you. Thank you.
Ты попытаешься ответить до того, как тебе написали, или попросим следующее?
Нет, давайте попросим написать, пока...
I'll first read the question and then we'll... We don't have much time left, so and it's not clearly audible. Next question, please.
Вопрос.
Алло?
Yes.
Здравствуйте. Меня слышно?
Hello, Alexandra. Can you hear me? Thank you so much for the lecture. I had a question of this kind. As far as I understand, even though it's a weak protest that doesn't aim to overthrow the government in a tangible way, from the point of view of the authorities, they praise it at its merits, and they actually they follow up strongly. So when all the doors were marked with chalk, the authorities can actually reclaim all those forms and use those forms of protest. Do we know any such examples? Yes. Well, for example, if the authorities start using the asterisks and the propaganda, or when the word war, the word war now has five letters, which is like lublю, I love you. So the stars, so the asterisks are not being used by authorities, but reclaiming you can see in the commemorative forms. For example, when there's a tragedy happening and indirectly authorities being blamed for this, people start using the flower memorials, for example, fire in Kemerovo with 50 people dying, and people started building up improvised memorials in different cities, and many people started.
There were spontaneous memorials set up throughout the city.
Started fighting this, and they started putting up
and then the authorities decided to step in and kind of make it their own, but that doesn't often happen.
Thank you. Any more questions?
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Can I ask it in English?
Yes, please.
Okay. Thank you very much for your lecture. I was wondering whether you encountered in your analysis, since you also study folklore in a broader sense, any, let's say, more traditional forms of what we could understand as folklore, like legends, like songs, like fables or fairy tales that are used in a way that is clearly or implicitly against political power in Russia?
Currently, yeah, yes, there is like urban legends and rumors there who are became weapon, and both sides. Okay, should I answer in
Ты можешь
Russian?
ответить на любом языке, тебя
Okay,
переведут.
then for сейчас urban legends
Now the urban legends and rumors are part of the warfare on both sides. For example, the proponents of war spread around a huge number of legends and narratives why one needs to fight. Whether, for example, Ukrainians are massively castrating our boys or poisoning the water with cholera, but there's also a protest folklore. For example, the narratives Putin has died a long time ago and we are being governed by doppelganger. And besides Professor Solovey, who is a proponent of that story, there's also, this is an important actually message, that there's no ruler in Russia and that the authority, the government has been hijacked by someone, by an imposter. So on both sides, there are urban legends that are being used.
Thank you.
Спасибо. Да, я сейчас попрошу задать следующий вопрос, пока прочитаю то, что я вижу в чате. Если случай использования...
I will read one more question from the chat.
Простите, я вас, может быть, хотели ответить, да? Выключили микрофон. Есть ли случай использования миноритарных языков?
Other examples of using minority languages to express anti-war hidden messages? Maybe Alexandra says, can you be more specific in your question? What do you mean? Can you... for example, Tatar language. In different languages, yes, that's widespread. For example, in the Tatar language and in Chuvash language and Komi language, there are people who are using those languages to say no war, and people are very proud of using minority languages for that.
Комментарий, что самозванец это вообще российская классика с 17 века.
Да, мы все это знаем, и все эти истории, они вновь...
We know all of these stories, they come alive once more.
Пожалуйста, следующий вопрос.
Next question, please. In response to the previous question, I wanted to say that Vlada Baranova has an article about protest in minority languages. And the comment I wanted to make is that one of my informants said, when he talked about this kind of indirect language, it was easier before because we had this kind of a figurative language that we could use to protest without any real consequences, whereas now this language is only being shaped. And that's why the situation is more challenging, because we don't yet know what kind of language will be understood by your own, but not by the authorities, what you will or will not be arrested for. What do you think about it? Do you agree? Because I keep thinking about it. Undoubtedly, this is a language that is forming now, that people are testing these boundaries, and there may be differences in the various regions. let's say in St. Petersburg and in Russia, in Moscow, people are being persecuted more for, they're persecuted more for kind of indirect forms of protest, such as wearing blue and yellow, whereas in Siberia, these kinds of hidden protests are ignored largely, and people are punished mostly for direct protest.
Следующий могу, да, попросить
Can I
следующего.
ask the next person to unmute?
Следующий комментарий. Да, вот просили сделать сейчас.
Можно я вопрос задам? Мне интересно, есть ли какая-то оценка
I
количества?
wanted to find out, is there an estimate of the growth of protest, maybe the percentage of the population that expresses protest in this way? Is there an estimate of how many people, how many of us don't support the war?
Ну, вы же прекрасно понимаете, что оценить это очень сложно.
I'm sure you realize that it is pretty much impossible to estimate this. There are some Russian field statistics. There are actually two sociology organizations. They don't ask direct questions like, do you support the war or not? But they do show that there are more and more people who are not satisfied. But we don't know that all of those people who are dissatisfied will write something on the walls or draw some graffiti. We have information from Olga 4 about how many people were arrested, were detained. I have 7,000 people who I know of 20 of that number of people who were arrested or fined for the discreditation of the army. So that's 10,000 people minimum. A year ago, Olga 4 talked about 20,000 people being detained for anti-war statements. Of course, there are also those who were not detained. So it's impossible to really put a number on it. Thank you very much. There's somebody was asking to make a comment. Sorry for not noticing it earlier. You are very welcome to have a look. I'm Gorana Jovanovic. I'm in Belgrade, Serbia.
To make my comments in English, if possible.
Yes, no problem, please.
So, thank you very much for your lecture. As I said, I'm in Serbia, and I would like to remind you that Serbia, or at that time Yugoslavia, was bombed in '99 by 19 countries which consider themselves as the most developed and most democratic countries in the world. So from that perspective, I would like to say more sensitive to assumptions that there is a division in the world between the lack of democracy and freedom, and on the other side, a garden of freedom and democracy. Unfortunately, I think we are lacking freedom everywhere, and we are lacking democracy everywhere. So, how is that related to the subject of your lecture? Of course, to be against the war is self-understandable. Nothing to object against that. But in the specific situation, unfortunately, the slogans, or the most of slogans, repeat the discourses of another hegemonic or even more hegemonic discourse and narrative. And so in that sense, I think there are somehow limitations in possibility to build some pathways to more free and democratic world. As we know, new wars are happening almost every day with no possibility to see the change in that policies. So the question remains how to solve the problems among humans in other ways than wars.
Well,
So this is my concern, and of course my fear, also based on my personal experience, and even almost 25 years after the bombing of Yugoslavia, which was a violation of international law, used depleted uranium. I mean, the perpetrators are still insisting it was their right, and it was what they did, it was right. So what credibility can we grant to such holders of freedom and democracy? So I hope you understand my sensitivity.
yes, I spend a lot of time.
Thank you very much. Спасибо большое.
Thank you. Yes, I spent a lot of time in Serbia last year. And yes, I know that many people to whom I was talking in Serbia and Belgrade and in Novi Sad, they told me that, yes, we don't understand you because Putin is our brother, because he is fighting for us and we hate United States because they're bombing us. Yes, and it's a terrible situation, and the reminders of and the thoughts about it are still alive. But I was not talking about all this, and I was not talking about the fight for democracy in the whole world. I was talking just about different approaches to how we can analyze protest if we see protest as a form of communication. That was my approach, and I was talking about researchers. So I don't know what I should say more about it.
Спасибо большое. Я, к сожалению, мы уже на самом деле вышли за рамки нашего времени.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we've run out of time already.
Просто я вот прочитаю вопрос, который не было слышно.
Я думаю, что все его видят. Давай я быстренько его перескажу.
Давай.
Молодой человек, который...
So the question in the chat: can we evaluate the influence of the protest of the week by the degree to which they are punished by the state if the purpose of such a protest is to spread their vision of reality?
Вопрос не очень понятен. Вот у вас...
To be honest, I don't quite understand this question. So we have a kilo of salt. It weighs a certain amount. The salt is salty. Sugar is sweet. These are two different parameters. One is weight, one is taste. So we have form, and then we have message. So I don't see any kind of, I didn't see a clash.
Спасибо большое. Тогда, пожалуйста, вот поднятые руки. У нас еще...
Thank you very much. We have two raised hands. Thank you very much for the lecture. I wanted to ask a few questions.
С чего начать, все это немножечко, может быть, не совсем в форме вопросов будет выложено. Однако же главный, ну, помимо там предыдущего, значит, комментария относительно того, что, значит, Россия борется с Америкой, и, соответственно, нужно бомбить Украину. Это,
So on the one hand, this was an interesting comment about how Russia should bomb Ukraine in order to protect itself against the US. I'd like to make a comment about Weapons of the Week, James Scott's book. As far as I understand, weapons are used for a specific purpose. And communication has an aim as well. When we talk about offstage transcripts, what are their aims? And the second question is, you talked about offstage transcripts in the context of the cordon sanitaire. That these transcripts get into the public space, so could you comment on the mechanism and what this leads to? And the third question, can we talk today about this cordon in the era of the internet, of social media? Is there any division between this kitchen talk and the outside world? And about can we talk about the impact of these messages depending on who they are aimed at?
Я думаю, что если вот на эти вопросы не получается дать каких-то конкретных реальных ответов,
I think that if there are no specific answers to these questions, it sounds a lot like Pelevin and his conversations about freedom. Thank you. Of course, we are talking about this kind of underground laughter, and I'm not I'm not banking on any kind of impact. I'm not a political scientist. It is not my aim to do that. I look at all of these processes from the perspective of human behavior. I'm looking at why they are doing this. It's very difficult to assess how impactful this is going to be. Modern semiotic guerrillas are not a single group with a similar background. Modern semiotic guerrillas have many different formats that they use. For some, this is Eigen-Sinn. They do things that they believe right for themselves. Within our small family, we do not accept the war in Ukraine. We're going to outwardly talk about how we support it, but in reality, we will not, and we know that we do not. So what they believe that it is, other people believe that it is important to change the minds of those who are watching TV and they're kind of zombified. Now we cannot talk about any kind of KPI. I'm sure that there will become a time where most people will have a change of heart. There will be a political change, a change of regime. They will take their civic activity and use it for the good. So there, we can't talk about KPI now. We're talking about KPI for the future. But now it doesn't make much sense to talk about it. Thank you very much. We are really, we've already got to our deadline, and this concerns our interpreters first and foremost. We can keep talking, but we will not have any interpretation, so we'll finish the interpretation for now. There are a couple of questions still, a couple of hands still raised, so you may ask your question in Russian.
Можно говорить? Меня слышно? Такой короткий вопрос, связанный тоже вот с hidden messages. Акция, то есть компания, которая проводит сейчас движение «Путь домой» жен мобилизованных, белые платки, насколько это соответствует именно вот hidden messages? Вот в таком плане вопрос короткий.
Смотрите, очень много людей, напоминаю, что протест жен мобилизованных – это протест женщин, которые требуют вернуть домой мобилизованных немедленно, потому что их обещали забрать типа на 1 год. Что здесь очень важно? Очень многие ругают этих жен мобилизованных, говорят, вот, они не против войны, они просто хотят, чтобы свои мужья вернулись, они думают только о себе и прочее, 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 мы не будем поддерживать, мы такие все прекрасные. На самом деле, и это очень важно понимать, это на самом деле классический пример такого оружия слабых, когда какие-то формы протеста, они максимально лежат в лояльном поле. Это так называемый легистский или легалистский вид протеста. Мы на самом деле, это очень важно, мы не знаем, что на самом деле думают эти женщины, но они пытаются не переступать границы ужасных законов, они пытаются вести себя максимально легалистским образом. Мы не говорим, что мы против войны, но только, пожалуйста, мужа верните и сейчас. И это действует, потому что они как бы используют вот легальные методы, привлекли к себе очень много внимания, и администрация президента вынуждена как-то с ними взаимодействовать, при этом не прибегая к прямым репрессиям, потому что формально они в легальном поле.
They're using legal methods to force the authorities to for a dialogue. So I see this protest as an important way of using the weak people's weapons.
Пожалуйста, еще один вопрос.
Thank you. And we have one last question on the chat.
Задайте, пожалуйста, ваш вопрос. Для этого
you can unmute yourselves and ask your question, but you have to switch on your microphone.
Здравствуйте, большое спасибо, Александра.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, for the lecture and for all your work. I have a question about spontaneous protests. For example, a person is being interviewed in the streets, like stopped by an interviewer, and suddenly the person starts speaking not exactly that they are against the war, but for example, what is the music that you listen, and or what concert would you like to attend? Well, to attend Shaman's concert. And which song of Shaman? No, I've actually never heard him. I want to attend his concert and listen to the Pride of Russia. And you can hear that the Pride of Russia is being said with sarcasm. Or they respond, what kind of music you listen? Do you listen to Noise MC or to Shaman? This is a complicated question. So what kind of music listen? So it's a spontaneous way of deceiving the interviewer. So do you consider this a kind of protest? This is a classic tactics of avoidance, when you intentionally give a dubious and ambiguous question, when the interviewer finds himself in an awkward situation. This is a very widespread and even increasingly spread method, and using ambiguous language of Aesopus. This is very flourishing method these days. Thank you so much. And the very last question with your mic on. Alexandra, yes. Hello, can you hear me? Great.
У меня вопрос про прямую линию с Путиным. Там на экране...
I wanted to ask you about the direct line with Putin. There, the screen showed some very harsh questions and people's question about the price of eggs, or how can you move to Russia, that is shown on the first TV channel. How do you think? What do you think? Is it a mishap, or it was an intentional move on the side of the authorities? There are both theories present, that this is an overlooking, or that is actually a way from the authorities to pretend that we have a democracy and questions. I didn't make any investigation. I don't have any means to prove any of the theories. Both can be right.
Большое спасибо.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone for your questions, to everyone who wrote your questions in the chat, and your comments and suggestions, and you express your gratitudes. Alexandra, you can find a lot of such comments in the chat.
Я не успела проиграть свою пьесу.
I didn't have enough time to follow my script, so asking you actually as to what I see here that can be compared and compatible to the dissidents' protests in the Soviet times, because when we write articles on the dissident movement, we say that this is a peaceful, intentionally peaceful protest, and this protest is also peaceful. Like when we now spoke about the wives of the mobilized men, that they are intentionally staying in the legal space. It's their intentional move, yes, of course, but then we can find this in the dissident movement as well. So there are quite a few parallels. And while preparing for today's conversation, I actually listed them, and I actually amended the list while we talked. So maybe when we have to have a follow-up conversation today, but we will have to start it from a different departure point. So by discussing
для сопоставления.
Possible comparing points. I would be delighted, says Alexandra. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who attended. Thank you for this conversation, which will stay with us. It will be published online, and we can revisit it, think about it again. And I hope we will be able to continue the conversation. Thank you so much, and see you at the next webinar. Thank you. Thank you to all the participants and to Olga. See you next time.